Last Legion UX.
I could not have said that better myself. This is Last Legion UX on the N64. This is a one-on-one robot fighting game by Hudson Soft, probably why there's a Bomberman cameo in here, actually a few times, and it's kind of sort of analogous to, say, Custom Robo or Virtual On, or dare I say it, Gotcha Force. Actually, I don't dare say that because this game isn't near as polished as any of those games. The story, or what I've been able to parse of it, you play a mech-piloting planetary magnate. Your most recently sold planet sold for a grand total of 4,500 yen, and as you go to cash your check, you realize quickly that this check was in fact a forgery. Now, with a thirst for vengeance, you arm your mech and head out to collect all the various Chaos Emeralds that power up all the other mechs ever in order to fight the guy who screwed you out of $45. For justice! Actually, it's entirely in Japanese, so I don't really know what the plot is, but let's just be honest, my version's better, and more importantly, there is a little bit of plot development between each fight. You conversing with your opponents, you sort of getting an idea of what you're supposed to be doing in between fights, and there's one or two in between fight cutscenes as well. So there is plot advancement, but unless you are fluent in Japanese, it's gonna go over your head. Import gaming, it's one of the few drawbacks. Now I think to start off, we need to talk about the customization of your mech. Because you've got, for story mode, about 6 mechs, and outside of story mode, in just like the standard one-on-one fighting and whatever, you have about twice as many. Some of which might have been unlockables, I'm not entirely certain. But there's a variance between the robots that each have their own different stats and skills, such as their speed, maneuverability, their ability to take a punch, their innate special abilities, we'll talk about that in a sec, as well as their explosive ordnance to deploy against various enemies. In addition to selecting your robot, however, there is more customization to be had. First of all, you have to select your main weapon. This is typically a ranged weapon, however, there are some melee variants that, well, they actually can use ranged attacks too, but they're more specialized for close range combat. These are things like rifles, sniper rifles, rocket launchers, bazookas, swords, a giant rubber hammer, and a big paper fan for reasons. And then once you've got that set up, you have to pick your shield, and there's actually significantly less options. There's like 4, with one of them being a gag weapon, which is a giant barrel lid for reasons. Decking out your robot for style points, you always need the giant barrel lid. Of course! It all makes sense now. Outside of the main customization of your robot, there's a lot of different tricks each robot can employ, some of them which are unique to each robot. And to talk about this, we're really going to have to talk about the controls. Now first, you move your robot with the control stick. You know, it's obvious. Z button controls your shield, and the shield's a little bit finicky in this game. Holding up the shield will allow you to deflect pretty much every single attack, but it seems kind of random that eventually your shield just completely without reason breaks. And it doesn't seem to be based around the idea that you were hit from a direction that you weren't blocking, or it just took a more powerful hit than anything. It's just random. And I know this because I sat there and tried to do the math on it for a while, and there was no correlation between how much damage your shield seemed to take and it exploding. You have the C right button, which is also the C up button, because of course it is, and this deploys your mech's explosive ordnance. In the case of my robot, it would be a planted mine, which has a special remote detonator, which means that you can use this to set up traps, as well as throwing it in midair, which will cause it to explode on impact. Other robots have more traditional explosives that require a little bit less strategy, but each one has their own unique strategy that is also complemented with how much damage they do. Basically, they're all unique, and they're exclusive to the robot you select. Next is C down, which is also C right, because again, of course it is. And this is the lock-on portion of the controls. And here's where things get to be a little bit rough, because locking onto your opponent is purely for the sake of the camera. All the weapons actually work on a very generous auto-targeting system. So locking onto your opponent doesn't really actually, cause your weapons to hit any better. It just means that you can actually see them. The problem with this is, as soon as you attack your opponent in any capacity whatsoever, or if your opponent walks next to you or behind you, your lock-on turns off. So unless you're rapidly hammering the C down button, well, the lock-on and in turn the camera is just complete garbage. And that actually makes playing this game a lot harder than it should be. You have the right shoulder button, which allows you to skate around on the ground. This means you'll be moving faster, but you lose a little bit in three-dimensional controls because, again, you're skating around. You don't have quite as much precision as stomping around as your robot, but it's definitely a lot better for evading attacks. The use of the A button will allow you to jump, useful for getting around the environments as you are fighting in a three-dimensional space, and the B button will allow you to attack with your ranged main weapon. And if you hold it down, you can activate your ranged weapon's unique charge ability. And depending on what weapon you have, this could vary in terms of a very powerful laser shot, a volley of homing missiles, or a giant paper fan in the case of the standard paper fan for, again, style points. These are very useful attacks, but because they require the charge up and getting knocked down causes you to lose your charge, you really have to be strategic and pick your moments carefully in terms of how you want to utilize this ability. But this is basically your bread and butter for doing the most amount of damage possible. Now we have two more abilities, and neither of them are mapped to the L button or anything, or even the control pad, which would have also been terrible, but they're not much better. If you hold A and Z, you will activate your mech's unique ability. Now, depending on what mech this is, it could be a giant laser beam turning your mech into a phoenix for a period of time, making them virtually invincible, as well as doing more damage to enemies around them, as well as making them move faster. Or in the case of my mech, which I literally found this button combination out on the penultimate fight, makes you temporarily invisible and hard to hit. Sometimes it's finicky, but basically if you see that energy gauge at the top start glowing a little bit, you can hit these two buttons together, hold them down for a sec, and then suddenly everything gets more awesome. I just wish it was mapped to a more sensible button or an obvious button, or that this game told you anything about it, but it doesn't. They just kind of expect you to either read the manual or get really lucky. Like, as I said, I didn't activate this until the second to last fight. I actually thought this was something exclusive to the computer opponents. And in addition, you have B and Z, which uses what appears to be a punching attack, but in actuality means your robot's trying to rip out the magical glowing Chaos Emerald of Destiny from your opponent, thus granting you an instant victory. Now that's pretty awesome, but of course, that sounds way overpowered. There has to be some balance, right? Well, there is. It's a little bit too harsh, I think. Basically, to utilize this move, you have to be so close to your opponent that you basically have to be standing in them. And I mean, to be fair, it's a basic punching attack. Of course, you're gonna have to be close, but even when getting so close that you're basically standing in your opponent, you still have like a 1 in 10 chance of it actually connecting, even if they're not moving. Like, seriously, this attack is ridiculously hard to land. But when you consider the attacks being somewhat convoluted, not very well conveyed, and also that horrible lack of camera control, it makes really controlling these mechs a lot more frustrating than it has any need to be. And that's a damn shame, because the actual beating the hell out of other robots is a lot of fun in this game. Seriously, it is a fantastically fun game when it wants to work, but you're constantly wrestling with the controls in order to make that work. In that regard, I think this game was definitely ahead of its time, but it needed a controller that was absolutely not the N64 one. It would have absolutely benefited from the second stick, or at the very least, an actual functional lock-on button, if only for the sake of the camera. The AI is relatively intelligent. They tend to avoid attacks as much as possible. I'm playing on the lowest setting, which I learned after recording this, but the enemies are still pretty tough. I lost once or twice up till the end, and then I lost a whole bunch of times. More on that in a minute, but the AI is relatively clever. They try and constantly stay out of the way. They try to use cover as much as possible. They don't try and formulate strategies too much once they're behind cover, though. I got to a moment where I did run into an opponent who hid around a corner, and I just sat there and waited for them to do something, and they didn't. So there are some AI quirks, but it's not completely stupid. And they do like to use their special abilities and different weapons and advantages along with the environment as much as possible. Now, let's talk about the final boss, because spoilers, there's a final boss, and it is stupid is a good word for it. I mean, Without even talking about a case in point, I recorded this game, a full playthrough, for about an hour and a half, and about 50 minutes of that at least was stuck on the final boss. The idea is he's this big giant mech that's constantly spinning around shooting homing missiles at you, and when he's spinning around, you've got like a 1 in 10 chance of actually hitting him, but you can hit him. And then once he stops doing that, he stops and fires a charge beam at you, and that's when you're supposed to hit him. Well, that's all well and good, but then after that, he starts becoming literally invincible for about 30 seconds, all while still firing homing attacks at you. So his attacks do a lot of damage. You have very little opportunities to actually hit him. It feels like a very unfair fight, and that's just part 1, because when you beat him, there's a part 2 where he turns into this Metroid-looking thing and charges you. And if he hits you, that's 75% of your health. And fun story, you don't recover health between forms, and if you lose on the second form, you have to start again. And that's just the first attack of that form. He's got a bunch of patterns that's very, very predictable, but even once you know what the pattern of the final boss is, the little bit of delay in controls, or the lack of precision in camera so you actually know where you are in relativity to him, a lot of problems just sort of come to a head when there's like one small error you make and suddenly you have to start again. And it'll be like another 5 minutes before you even face this form, assuming you get to it. That is all kinds of horrible. But that said, it's still beatable. The enemies are clever, except for that final boss who's just dumb, and it's basically memorize this pattern and hold down the shield when he's not able to be hit. The different environments allow you to use each unique arena's topography to your advantage, either to lay out traps or to just, get a breather from your opponents. Overall, arenas are really well made here. They're great. And aside from the controls and the weird amounts of slowdown at times, the game is completely playable and absolutely fun. There's slowdown out the wazoo, and half the time it feels like it's there intentionally for climactic reasons. Other times it's just, we have absolutely made a game that does not entirely work with this hardware. We need better hardware to run this thing. And, well, the controls are just horrible, but it is an N64 game. What do you expect? That controller was not really made with, honestly, anything in mind. But if you can get past that stuff, gameplay is fantastic. Now, the presentation, too, Last Legion UX is, it's really damn good, actually. The environments, like I said, they're well designed. They've got unique topography. They look very, very nice. They're kind of memorable, too. I really like that one area with the giant floating crystal pyramids. I like the underwater levels. Hell, I like the final boss level as much as I hate that final boss. I like all the levels in this game. They're really, really nice. The unique robot designs are fantastic, including the giant mech piloted by Bomberman for some reason, and I don't have footage of this, but I swear there is a giant gold Bomberman statue in honor of that hidden secret bonus in Bomberman Hero. The weapons are fantastic, and you can tell how unique each weapon is just from their visual appearance. You don't even have to see them fired to say, okay, that enemy has that one bazooka-looking thing. I need to avoid that at all costs because that charges up and fires a bunch of homing missiles at me. Or, that one guy's got the beam saber, so I have to watch out for crescent slashes coming my way, and I really gotta stay out of that melee range. The shields, well, aside from that giant pot lid shield, they're kind of all just there. They don't look particularly interesting. They don't seem to even have different stats, so it's really just pick the one that looks kind of best, I guess. But overall, the visual design in this game is pretty top-notch in all regards. And the soundtrack is fantastic. It's pulse-pounding, it's fast-paced, and it sounds like, hey, look at me, I'm piloting a big angry robot, stay the hell out of my way. And I love it. The only thing I could complain about the soundtrack is they are very, very short loops. And to be fair, it is a fighting game. I guess they don't expect you to be playing very long rounds, but each song loops like after 45 seconds. But overall, the presentation is pretty fantastic, I think. Now, if you want a copy of Last Legion UX, I will never get that name right, I swear. Despite it being an import game, and more importantly, despite it being an import N64 game, this game actually holds its price pretty well. I mean, comparatively speaking, I got my copy of Yoshi's Story and Mario 64 for a grand total of 2 cents. Whereas this one is one of 2 that I can think of that not only held its price, but actually went up in price a little bit. The other being Sin and Punishment. And like Sin and Punishment, this game tends to sit at the $60 to $100 range. I got mine, I think, on a complete fluke for about 30, and I'm glad I did because it's a fun game, but at that high a price, I can't recommend it. Because you could get fantastic games like Custom Robo, which gives you pretty much the exact same experience, or Custom Robo V2, which gives you the exact same experience, more or less, but at, well, almost a tenth of the cost, depending on how much you pay for this, and you got more customization from it, and honestly more fun out of couch co-op, because that's what this game is designed for, I think, is, you know, playing with a buddy on a couch, like, similarly to Custom Robo, but this one's just a bit too expensive, and it just feels like it lacks the polish of the competition on the same console, and even on the competition's console, because there's lots of things that are kinda sorta like this, and while they're all fascinating and really fun to play, this one's just a little bit too expensive and not quite as well done as it should be. I think if they took it back to the drawing board and spent maybe a little bit more time refining and just making sure everything worked and maybe put a few more layers on that customization system, they would have had something. It's a fun robot fighting game, but not one you should actively search out, especially for the cost it normally commands.
Lose.